When my son called me crazy, I felt a rush of anger and betrayal. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything between us. Without warning, I revised the terms of his inheritance. I was done letting him disrespect me, and I wanted to make sure he understood the consequences of his words. As I drafted the new will, a cold sense of satisfaction washed over me, but it was quickly replaced with uncertainty. I knew this would drive a wedge between us, but part of me felt it was necessary. The weight of my choice settled on me as I realized how far apart we had grown. The line between us had shifted, and there was no going back. Before we dive back in, let us know where you're tuning in from. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow, I've got something even more special lined up just for you. It happened in an instant. The words hit me like a slap across the face, sharp and unforgiving. My son, the one person I had poured my heart into, called me crazy. The air seemed to freeze around me, and for a moment, I could hardly breathe. The sting of his words cut deeper than any physical blow ever could. I had always been there for him, through every scrape, every tear, every triumph and failure. I had sacrificed so much of myself for his future, and yet, here he was, standing in front of me, dismissing everything I had ever done. I remember the way his face twisted in frustration, eyes wide with contempt, as though the love I had offered him all these years meant nothing. The betrayal was instantaneous and searing. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation for such cruelty, but the words wouldn't come. I could barely contain the overwhelming rush of emotion that surged through me. Hurt, anger, confusion. How could he do this to me? We had been through so much together. I had raised him on my own after his mother had passed away when he was just a child. Every decision I made, every sacrifice I made, had been for his future. I worked long hours at a job I didn't enjoy, kept a roof over our heads, and made sure he had every opportunity to succeed. Yet, somehow, this was how he repaid me, by calling me crazy in front of a room full of people. It wasn't the first time he had been distant or dismissive, but this felt different. This was a line crossed, a point of no return. And as the weight of his words hung heavy in the air, I realized something fundamental. The bond between us had fractured in a way I hadn't fully understood until that moment. My son, the person I loved more than anything in this world, was no longer the person I had thought him to be. I had always prided myself on being a good parent, on doing everything in my power to raise him right. But now, faced with his scorn, I was forced to confront a painful truth. I had failed him in ways I hadn't yet acknowledged. But what hurt the most was the sudden realization that all those years of sacrifice had left me feeling small. In my quest to give him everything, I had given so much of myself that I didn't even recognize the person staring back at me in the mirror. I had spent so much time worrying about his future that I had neglected my own. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with the weight of his words. The silence that followed was deafening, and as I stood there, speechless and in shock, something inside me snapped. Without thinking, I made a decision that would change everything. Something had to shift. I couldn't let him speak to me that way. I couldn't just let this go, not this time. There had to be consequences for his words, for the way he had treated me, for the way he had dismissed everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed for him. With the sting of his words still fresh in my mind, I turned away. My legs felt shaky beneath me, and the room seemed to spin, but I knew what I had to do. No longer would I sit by, trying to please him, trying to earn his approval. No longer would I be the person who gave and received nothing in return. I walked toward my office, shutting the door behind me. I sat down at my desk, the cold, hard surface of the wood grounding me. My hands trembled as I reached for the papers I had been avoiding for months. The will. I had always been clear about my intentions for him when I was gone. I had worked hard to ensure that he would be taken care of, that his future would be secure. But in that moment, with his words still echoing in my mind, I realized that nothing I had planned for him felt right anymore. The thought of leaving him everything I had worked for, felt like the ultimate betrayal of my own self-worth. If he thought I was crazy, if he thought I didn't deserve respect, then I wasn't going to let him walk away with the fruits of my labor. I opened the drawer where I kept the will, and I pulled it out. The ink on the paper seemed to mock me, the decision I had made a mere formality now. As I read through the familiar lines, something inside me twisted, and I picked up the pen. A single line through the existing terms. I made my mark. I changed everything. I couldn't quite explain why it felt so final, so right. But in that moment, it felt like the only thing I could do to reclaim my dignity, my worth, my sense of control. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about power, about making him understand that there were consequences for his actions. And as I sat there, looking at the altered will, the words I had written felt like a declaration. A declaration that I would no longer be the doormat, the one who took the disrespect, the one who always gave without ever receiving. It wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about standing up for myself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had done something for me. The decision was made, and I couldn't take it back. I was ready to face whatever came next. I had always been the provider, the protector. When my wife passed away, I found myself in a position no one should ever have to face, raising a child on my own. There were days I didn't know how I was going to get through, how I was going to manage. But I did. I had no choice. There's a certain kind of loneliness that comes with being a single parent, especially when you have no one to turn to for help. It's not just about the late nights or the early mornings. It's the constant weight of the responsibility, the way it never seems to lift. From the day I brought him home from the hospital, it was just the two of us. I remember the long, sleepless nights, holding him in my arms as he cried, wishing I could somehow make things easier. But there was no one else. There was no one else to help carry the burden. And so I carried it all. I worked multiple jobs, anything I could do to make sure he had what he needed. There was no such thing as a sick day or a day off. There was no time to rest. I remember waking up at 5 a.m. to get him ready for school, rushing through breakfast, then taking him to daycare while I worked long shifts at a job I hated. Every night, I'd come home exhausted, but I'd still find the energy to help him with his homework, to listen to him talk about his day, to make sure he knew he was loved. Through all of this, I sacrificed. I sacrificed my own happiness, my own desires, and my own time to ensure that he never felt the sting of abandonment or loss. I didn't have the luxury of going out with friends or taking vacations. I didn't get to enjoy the things that most people take for granted. But it didn't matter. All I cared about was providing a better life for him. I wanted him to have everything I didn't: a stable home, opportunities, education, a sense of security. And he had it. Or at least I thought he did. As the years passed, I watched him grow from a sweet, loving child into a teenager who began to distance himself. The awkward years of adolescence were challenging for both of us, but I did my best to stay involved, to stay present. He started to change, becoming more independent, more distant. I didn't mind that he wanted to spread his wings. It was natural. It was what every parent wanted for their child: independence, success, confidence. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. I don't know when exactly, but I began to feel like I wasn't enough for him anymore. My presence, my efforts, everything I had done to build a life for him seemed to fade into the background as he found other sources of validation. His friends became his priority, and I became just another adult figure, someone to be tolerated, not truly loved or valued. I watched this transformation from a distance, powerless to stop it. Every attempt to reach out was met with a polite, distant response. It wasn't that he was cruel or ungrateful, at least, not overtly, but the warmth I once felt from him seemed to have evaporated. He was polite, sure, but the spark between us, the bond, was fading. And I didn't know how to fix it. I tried to talk to him about it, tried to understand where things had gone wrong, but every conversation felt like a struggle. He told me I was overbearing. He told me I needed to let go. And like any parent who fears losing their child, I backed off, trying to respect his need for space. But with every step back I took, it felt like we drifted further apart. The more I tried to give him the freedom he asked for, the more it felt like I was losing him entirely. The turning point came when he graduated from high school. I had been so proud of him, so hopeful for his future. But as I watched him walk across that stage, all I could think about was the distance between us. My heart swelled with pride, but at the same time, I felt a pang of loss, as though he was slipping through my fingers. He had everything ahead of him: college, friends, adventures, but I wasn't sure if I was even a part of that future anymore. He went off to college, and I thought maybe it would be different. Maybe space would help us reconnect, or at least give him the time to appreciate what I had done for him. But the calls grew infrequent. His visits home became shorter and more strained. It wasn't until he came home during winter break that I truly realized how much had changed. It was then that I started to see the signs of his resentment. Little things at first: dismissive comments, a tone I hadn't heard before, a lack of gratitude for the things I had done. I dismissed it, chalked it up to the pressures of school, to the struggles of being young and figuring things out. But deep down, I knew something was off. And then came that day, the day he called me crazy. We were sitting at the kitchen table, talking about his future plans. I had been offering advice, trying to help him think through his decisions. I guess I was being a bit more insistent than I realized. It wasn't the first time he had gotten frustrated with me, but this time, it felt different. This time, there was a finality to it, a sharp edge to his words that left me reeling. "Dad, you're crazy," he had said, looking at me with an expression I couldn't place. Disgust? Disappointment? Whatever it was, it stung. And just like that, everything shifted. All those years of sacrifice, all the love I had poured into him, seemed to evaporate in that single harsh moment. The man I had raised, the boy who had once clung to me for comfort and guidance, had turned into someone I didn't recognize. Someone who saw me as a burden, a crazy old man who didn't understand his life. My heart sank. In the quiet that followed, I realized I had been living in a fantasy. I had thought that if I just gave enough, did enough, that somehow he would always see me as the person he could count on. But he didn't see that. He didn't appreciate it. And now, I was left with nothing but the hollow echo of his words. The shock of that moment, his words, so sharp and unrelenting, had left me speechless. I had sat there in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. How could he speak to me like that? I had spent his entire life trying to give him everything he needed, sacrificing my own comfort and desires to ensure he had a future he could be proud of. Yet in that single instant, I felt like I had lost him. It wasn't just the words that stung, but the realization that everything I had done, everything I had believed about our relationship, had been shattered. I tried to shrug it off in the hours that followed. I told myself it was a one-off, an outburst born from stress, from the weight of his own growing pains. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The truth that he had been pulling away from me for a long time now. He had been distancing himself emotionally and physically, and I had been blind to it. I had been so focused on giving him the world that I had failed to see the slow unraveling of our bond. Over the next few days, I tried to talk to him, to make sense of what had happened. But each conversation ended in frustration, with him retreating further into himself. I had hoped that maybe, just maybe, we could rebuild our relationship, but it felt like he was already gone. In those moments, I could almost hear his voice in my head, taunting me, "You're crazy. You're just an old man trying to hold on to something that's already slipping away." And then, just when I thought I couldn't feel more helpless, the full scope of the betrayal came crashing down on me. It wasn't just the harsh words. No, it was much more than that. As I sat at my desk one night, going over some financial documents, something I did regularly to stay on top of things, I stumbled upon a set of emails. At first, I thought nothing of it. My son had always been a little secretive about his life, and I had respected that. But as I scrolled through the inbox, something caught my eye. A string of messages between him and someone I didn't recognize. The emails were casual at first, but as I read on, the tone shifted. It was clear that they had been discussing my finances, my investments, my properties, my assets. And that's when it hit me like a ton of bricks. My son wasn't just pulling away from me emotionally, he was plotting against me. The more I read, the more my stomach twisted. He had been talking to a lawyer, one I had never met, and they were discussing ways to take control of my estate. The emails were vague, but it was clear they were planning something. Something underhanded. It wasn't enough for him to simply distance himself from me emotionally. Now he was trying to manipulate my finances, to take what I had worked so hard for, to claim my wealth for himself before I even passed away. The anger I felt in that moment was beyond anything I had ever experienced. It was as if he had reached into the very core of me and ripped out everything I held dear. My trust, my love, my sense of security. I had always known that inheritance was a sensitive subject, but I had never imagined that he would take it to this extreme. The betrayal was no longer just emotional. It was financial, calculated, and cruel. As I sat there, staring at the screen, I felt a cold rage building inside me. I had never imagined my son, my flesh and blood, would be capable of such manipulation. How had it come to this? How had the person I had given everything to become someone who would plot behind my back to take what I had built? The more I thought about it, the more it sickened me. How had he gotten so far gone? Was it the influence of his friends, his new life at college? Or had I simply failed to see the changes in him? The growing entitlement, the bitterness, the sense that everything owed him? The reality of the situation settled over me like a dark cloud. Not only had he rejected me emotionally, not only had he belittled my efforts, but now he was taking the very thing I had worked my entire life to provide for him. He thought he could outsmart me, take advantage of me in my old age. But he was wrong. So very wrong. I stood up from my desk, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I could feel the heat of anger rising within me, but there was something else too, something darker. A sense of powerlessness, a recognition that I had let this happen. I had been so focused on doing the right thing, on providing, that I had failed to see the signs of the man my son was becoming. But I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I couldn't. Not after everything I had given up for him. Not after the years of sacrifice. I would not be a pawn in his game. I would take back control. It was in that moment that a quiet, steady resolve began to form within me. He had crossed a line, but I would show him what happens when you take advantage of someone who has been nothing but loyal to you. The shock of betrayal had shaken me to my core, but it also ignited something else, something that had been dormant for too long. I wasn't going to sit by and let him destroy me. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I would take action. I would fight back. The cold, sharp edge of betrayal still cut through me, but now, it wasn't just about protecting my money or my future. It was about protecting my dignity, my pride. It was about taking back control of my life. I reached for the phone. It was time to make a call. Time to do something I had never imagined I'd have to do. Fight for what was mine. The phone call felt surreal. I had never imagined a day would come where I'd be sitting here, dialing a lawyer's number with the intention of using legal measures to protect myself from my own son. It felt wrong in so many ways, but in the aftermath of what I had discovered, it was the only option left. There was no other way forward. He had crossed a line, and now it was time for me to defend myself. The call connected, and I was met with the familiar, calm voice of my lawyer, Susan. She had been handling my estate for years, and I trusted her implicitly. I didn't waste any time. "Susan," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need you to make some changes to my will. Immediately." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear her wondering what had happened. "Of course," she replied, her voice softening. "But what changes are we talking about? Is everything okay?" I couldn't bring myself to explain everything over the phone. Not yet. So, I just said the one thing that made it all clear. "I want you to revoke the inheritance clause for my son." Another pause. "Are you sure about this?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes. Absolutely. I'll be coming over to the office tomorrow to sign the new documents." I could feel the weight of her silent concern, but she didn't argue. She had always respected my wishes, no matter how difficult they were. I'll see you tomorrow then. I hung up the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't about the money, at least not in the way my son thought. He believed that taking what was mine would solve everything for him. But I was about to make sure he didn't have that option. I had worked too hard, fought too long, and sacrificed too much to let him take it all without consequence. But there was something else I needed to address first, the one thing that could truly tip the scales in my favor. My thoughts turned to something I had kept hidden for years, an asset that no one knew about, not even my son. It wasn't a large fortune or anything extravagant, but it was enough. Enough to ensure that I could take control of my own life and protect myself. Enough to give me the leverage I needed to make my son understand that his actions had real consequences. You see, I had kept a secret from him, a secret that I had carefully guarded for years. Over the course of my career, I had made some wise investments. They weren't flashy or publicized. I hadn't told anyone about them because, frankly, I didn't want the attention. But what I had accumulated in a private account was significant enough to give me some breathing room. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life without relying on my son or anyone else. I had built that small but stable portfolio for my own peace of mind, knowing that I might not always be around to work. I didn't want to be a burden to anyone, least of all him. The last thing I ever wanted was to rely on my son's charity. But now, with everything that had unfolded, I was ready to take it all into account. I wasn't planning to give him this hidden fortune. Far from it. If anything, this secret account would serve as a reminder that I wasn't helpless, that I still had power over my life. He thought he could take everything I had worked for, but he was about to realize that it wasn't his to claim. The next morning, I met Susan at her office, and as we went over the changes, she looked at me with a quiet understanding in her eyes. "You've thought this through," she said, her voice gentle but firm. It wasn't a question. I nodded. He won't appreciate the lesson, but he needs it. Susan didn't question my decision, and within an hour, the documents were finalized. My son would receive nothing from my estate. Not a penny, not a property, not a single asset. I wasn't leaving him a cent. All those years of taking care of him, all the sacrifices I made, it had amounted to this moment, where I decided that he needed to learn that respect and gratitude were earned, not given. But there was more to this story. More than just the will. More than just the inheritance. I had another surprise in store for him. I had quietly invested in a small piece of real estate that had appreciated significantly over the years. No one knew about it. Not even my son. It wasn't a mansion or a sprawling estate, but it had become a valuable asset. If I chose to sell it, it would provide me with more than enough to secure my future and my independence. I could live comfortably without depending on anyone. In the grand scheme of things, this small fortune was my lifeline. It was my way of ensuring that I could live out my days on my terms, without being manipulated or controlled by anyone. And now, it was my weapon. As I walked out of Susan's office, holding the newly signed documents, I felt a strange sense of calm. The decision had been made. I had taken control of my future again. But there was still one thing left to do. One more step I had to take before the final confrontation. I needed to confront my son. There was no more running away from the reality of the situation. I had allowed him to think he could walk all over me, that his entitled behavior was acceptable. But now, I was going to make sure he understood just how wrong he was. I was done being the victim. I was done being passive. The power had shifted. And now, I was the one in control. I went home, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity. The will was changed, the asset secured, and my plan was in motion. I was ready to face my son. I was ready to show him that respect wasn't something you could take for granted. But there was something else. Something nagging at the back of my mind. As much as I wanted to make him suffer, as much as I felt justified in my actions, I couldn't ignore the hurt. I couldn't erase the love I still felt for him, despite everything. But that was the hardest part of all. The realization that, no matter what happened next, this was the end of something that could never be repaired. And once it was over, there would be no turning back. It was time. I had spent days in quiet preparation, reflecting on the decision I had made. There was no more doubt, no more second-guessing. I had come to terms with the fact that the relationship I had once treasured was no longer the same, and no amount of pleading, reasoning, or effort could restore it to what it once was. The betrayal was deep, and the hurt was undeniable. But now, I had the power to control the outcome of this situation. The changes were made, and the inheritance was no longer his to claim. But even as I held the newly signed documents in my hands, a part of me hesitated. Could I really go through with it? Could I confront him, tell him the truth, and not feel the sharp pang of regret that I knew would come after? After everything I had done for him, could I truly close the door on my son, the child I had raised with love and sacrifice? The answer, however painful, was yes. I didn't want to lose him. I didn't want this to be the end. But the man I had once known, who had been filled with potential and promise, was now someone I didn't recognize. And more importantly, someone who no longer respected me. Respect, as I had learned the hard way, could not be forced or given freely. It had to be earned. And he had destroyed the very thing that kept us connected, the trust between us. That was something I could no longer ignore. So, I waited for him to come home. When he arrived, there was a tension in the air, thick, palpable, as though the moment of reckoning was hanging over us. He walked in, greeted me casually, his face betraying nothing of the emotions he must have been feeling after our last confrontation. I was prepared for this. I had rehearsed the conversation in my mind 1,000 times, each possible outcome running through my head. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice steady but firm. He glanced at me, his eyes momentarily flickering with uncertainty, before he shrugged and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. His posture was defensive, almost as if he knew what was coming but wasn't ready to face it. "You've been acting weird lately," he said, half joking, as if the last few weeks hadn't been marked by nothing but tension and growing resentment. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I had always tried to be honest with him, always tried to lead by example. But this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about making sure he understood that actions had consequences. I couldn't let him think that disrespect would go unchallenged. "I'm not acting weird," I said, locking eyes with him. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and about the way you've treated me recently." The words hung between us, heavier than I anticipated. His face faltered for a moment, confusion and defensiveness flickering in his eyes. But I couldn't stop now. This had to be said. "You called me crazy," I continued. "And that's not the worst part. The worst part is what you've been doing behind my back. I found out about the emails, the conversations you've been having about my estate." His face drained of color. For a moment, he looked like a deer caught in headlights. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I pushed forward, not giving him a chance to backpedal. "You thought you could manipulate me, that you could take what was mine without me noticing. You thought you could get away with it. But you were wrong. I've changed the will. You're not getting anything from me." The shock in his eyes was immediate. For the first time in months, I saw a flicker of the boy I once knew. The one who used to look at me with admiration, trust, and love. But that boy was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle in his way. He opened his mouth again, but this time, his voice was hoarse. "Dad, I didn't mean." "No," I interrupted, my voice hard. "Don't even try to justify it. You crossed a line. And now you need to understand that actions have consequences. You need to learn that you can't just take whatever you want without considering the people around you. And you certainly can't treat the people who've given everything for you with this level of disrespect." His face twisted in anger, then in hurt, but I stood my ground. "This isn't about the money. It never was. This is about the way you've treated me. I won't sit by and let you think you can walk all over me." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, uncomfortable and heavy. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the the realization dawning on him. But it was too late for apologies, too late for reconciliation. The damage had already been done. "I don't know what to say," he muttered finally, his voice small, unsure. "There's nothing to say," I replied, my voice softening just slightly, though the firmness remained. "The truth is, you need to figure out who you want to be. You can't keep living in a world where people are there to serve you, where you can take and take without giving anything back. I won't be part of that world." I stood up, looking at him one last time. The hurt was still there, lingering beneath my words, but I felt something else now too, something stronger. It wasn't anger or resentment anymore. It was clarity. It was empowerment. "Goodbye," I said, not as a final farewell, but as the closing of a chapter that had run its course. The door between us had been irrevocably closed. The son I had loved so deeply, who had once been the center of my world, was now a stranger. But in that moment, I realized I had done everything I could for him. I had given him every opportunity. But it wasn't enough. And maybe, just maybe, that was the lesson he needed to learn. I left the room and went outside, breathing in the cool air, feeling the weight of the past few days lift from my shoulders. It wasn't the end I had imagined, but it was the end we needed. I had finally taken control of my life again, and for the first time in years, I felt free. As the door shut behind me, I couldn't help but think of the journey I had been on. From the sacrifices to the betrayal, to the hidden power that I had kept for myself. And now, as I walked away from the wreckage of what had once been, I realized something important. Sometimes, you have to lose what you love in order to find the strength to rebuild yourself. And that was something my son would never understand. Not yet, anyway.